It's great to see everybody. Just before I bring my slides up, I should say my 15-year-old son is sitting opposite me on his computer, and when Lyon said that this will be transcribed and put on our YouTube channel, I got a look which most parents are used to getting from their teenage children, as in, really? YouTube? You that cool? Anywho, moving swiftly on, I will bring up my slides. Fiona, you can tell me if they are visible. In a second, I'll just bring them up onto the...
They are visible, thank you, Adam.
Screen. There we go. Can you see that? Brilliant. Excellent. Well, it's great to have you all with us again. Those of you who were here for the first part of my talk will remember that what I'm trying to do is really trying to knit together some of the themes that have influenced the design and execution of state ceremonial in Scotland over the last 5 centuries. But they are very much my reflections. They're not a lineal description of events, not even a description of, as it were, the calendar of state events. I hope to cover most of them over the course of the next 3/4 of an hour or so. I may miss some, I may miss your favourite, in which case I'll just have to be a third lecture. But let us begin, and we should begin at the beginning. Through the early months of 1914, military planners in capitals across Europe met to refine their plans for the opening days and weeks of a conflict that they saw as inevitable. Armies were ready, timetables printed, and mobilization drills fresh in the memory. In Berlin on the 1st of June, General von Moltke, the German Chief of Staff, observed to one of his colleagues, "We are ready, and the sooner the better for us." But for Europe's royal families, it was business as usual. The annual run of ceremonies of state in the household continued to be observed. The growth of the popular press and advances in transportation, first railways and then the motor car, meant that royalties, as Queen Mary called them, could be seen by their people much more closely and much more often. There were security concerns. In 1908, the King of Portugal, together with the Crown Prince, had been assassinated as they rode together in an open carriage in Lisbon. In 1906, a bomb was thrown at the carriage of King Alfonso XIII of Spain and Queen Victoria Eugenie as they left church after their wedding. And as recently as 1913, a Catalan separatist had tried to shoot King Alfonso at a military parade. So it was that one summer's day in 1914, a royal couple found themselves travelling in an open vehicle through the crowded streets of their regional capital. Turning into the street at a junction, the driver slowed, momentarily unsure as to the route. At that moment, the assailant struck. The next morning's paper reported that it all happened with lightning rapidity. The woman was seen to make a dash at the crucial moment. A policeman grasped her dress, but he failed to get a secure hold and she slipped free. But the constable followed up and, gripping the woman around the waist, dragged her back from the carriage. She was within a foot of Her Majesty and succeeded in dropping a small object into the carriage around which a suffragette message was wrapped. Within a few seconds, she was hustled from the middle of the street onto the pavement, where she was the centre of a hostile crowd who booed loudly. It was later discovered that she was the same woman who'd created a similar scene in Victoria Road, Dundee, as Their Majesties were passing that thoroughfare to Den's Works on Friday afternoon. There's so much in this short report that is of interest. King George V and Queen Mary were on a visit to Edinburgh during what had become and remains known as Royal Week. The suffragette incident occurred on Sunday, the 12th of July, shortly after the royal couple had emerged from St Giles, having attended Sunday service. Within the context of this evening's talk, that week, the events in Edinburgh, the royal visit to Dundee, follow a pattern with which we're all familiar today, and yet at the time was quite novel. No monarch had attended an ordinary Sunday service at St Giles since George IV, albeit rather reluctantly, in 1822. No monarch had woven regional visits into the pattern of the week before. No monarch had, outside the context of the summer visit to Balmoral, involved their children in the public events in such a way before. Within the wider context, the service at St Giles and the way in which it is reported is fascinating. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated on the 28th of June, only a matter of days before Royal Week. Possibly for the first but not the last time, the attendance of the monarch at a service at St Giles provided an opportunity for a moment of national reflection in uncertain times. The Scotsman reported that the atmosphere in the cathedral was well ordered, quiet, and dignified. It printed the sermon verbatim given by the minister, the Reverend Dr. Wallace Williamson, on a text taken from Proverbs: "Where there is no vision, the people perish." In the months and years to come, that text would be written hard into hundreds of thousands of headstones. The central role of the Church of Scotland in the evolution of state ceremonial in this country over the last century is one that I hope also to explore this evening. Not just in encouraging its use, but as we will see, the influence of two sons of the manse in seeking to discourage its use as they sought to create a new post-evolution secular Scotland. In addition, we may also touch on the use of royal visits as a lightning rod for popular protest. We like to think, sometimes, that we have only just discovered how to misbehave. No, we haven't. There's a clear thread that ties the lone Dundonian suffragette of 1914 to the solitary member of the crowd who heckled the proclamation of King Charles. Both were, to use the Scotsman again, swallowed up by a hostile crowd. For those of you who attended the first part of this talk, you may recall that we started with the departure of King James VI and I for London in 1603 and ended with a visit of George V to Dunfermline in 1923. This evening we'll go back just a little bit to the opening of the Thistle Chapel. Try saying that again. The opening of the Thistle Chapel by King George V in 1911, and then forward linearly to today. There's been a huge amount of innovation in state ceremonial in Scotland in that time, probably more so than in any other time and in any other part of the United Kingdom. The two eras of greatest development were the reigns of King George V and Queen Elizabeth, albeit both Edward VIII and George VI have left their mark as well. Over the century, Scotland has evolved from the fully integrated industrial workshop of the United Kingdom to become a semi-detached, and some would want fully detached, social workshop of that same United Kingdom. Between the passage of the Church of Scotland Act of 1921 and the Church of Scotland Act of 1921 and the Scotland Act of 2016, state ceremonial in this country has become more apparent, more present, and arguably even more flamboyant. This evening I hope to explore why that might be the case. So let us hop into our time machine and hurtle back to the summer of 1911. In July 1911, George V and Queen Mary arrived in Edinburgh for their first visit following their coronation. The highlight of the week was the opening of the Thistle Chapel. This is not the time, and there is not the time this evening, to review the history of the order nor of the chapel. We're fortunate that both are the subject of excellent works by Elizabeth Rhodes, by Peter Galloway, and the late Charles Burnet, among many others. The opportunity that I have is to tease out the essentials of the ceremonial surrounding both the summer and winter services for the order, and to explore how what is in one sense very recent ceremonial has evolved over the century and a bit since the opening of Lord Leven and Melville and Robert Lorimer's extraordinary Gothic masterpiece of a chapel. On the eve of the service at St Giles, the King and Queen were given a tour of the chapel, 20 minutes allocated, and the presentation of the individuals most closely connected with the design and construction of the chapel might seem a tad on the brief side, but we must remember that George V was not a man to linger, unlike the Queen, whose enforced exile in Florence as a teenager, where her parents sought refuge from their creditors, clearly gave her a lifelong interest in fine art. So, the royal household offered the King and Queen a perfect afternoon. Accompanied by the Duke of Rothesay and the Duke of Connaught, they went first to the Thistle Chapel, where the King could have discussed the ceremonial for the next day, and the Queen might observe Phoebe Traquair's enamel work. Thence to the castle, where the King was presented with the keys by the governor, and the Queen got to inspect the honours. As the Scotsman reported rather breathlessly the following day, the Queen in particular, who it was remarked was looking exceedingly well, made a close inspection of the crown and handled several of the jewels. Doubtless the senior officials of the Ministry of Works counted them all out and counted them all back in again. From the castle, the royal party descended to the Royal Scottish Academy, which they visited along with the National Gallery, before returning to Holyrood House. The opening of the Thistle Chapel was part of an extensive royal week in Scotland, and you can sense the advice of the King's ministers that it would be appropriate for their Majesties to spend more formal time in Scotland. In December 1910, the Liberals had been returned to government following an election called after the collapse of the Constitutional Conference, set up to try and resolve the impasse between the government and the House of Lords over the passage of finance bills. Lord George's 1909 budget had been rejected in the Lords. That led into the January 1910 election, which the Liberals won comprehensively. The government had then introduced its Parliament Bill to restrict the power of the Lords to reject finance measures, and that bill was in turn rejected in the Upper House. The King granted Asquith another dissolution, and the country went back to the polls for its second winter election, returning the Liberals to government with an overwhelming majority of seats in Scotland. The power of the House of Lords was not the only political controversy to split the country. Home Rule was very live and would become the dominant issue for the new government, relying as it did on the support of the Irish nationalists for its majority. Home Rule all round meant that Scotland was also expecting a measure of devolution, and legislation to that effect was laid before the Commons in 1912. Here then we might observe the first driver of enhanced state ceremonial in Scotland, the playing of what has been termed the Scottish card. Both supporters of Home Rule and the Union became comfortable with enhanced ceremonial in Scotland. For the former, it spoke to the country's partnership in a union of several ancient parts. For the latter, it reinforced Scotland's uniqueness within the bonds of a national and an imperial family. Everyone was happy. It should also be noted in passing that the Scottish card is still in play to this day, but a bit like the Irish question, which whenever the English thought they had answered it, the Irish changed the question. So the rules for playing the Scottish card are not entirely understood, and no one is quite sure whether the card is kept, although there are strong rumours that it was last seen in a cupboard in the Lyon office. Returning to July 1911, the King and Queen made their formal arrival into Edinburgh by train on the afternoon of Monday 17th July and processed by carriage from the Caledonian station to Holyrood House, escorted by the Scots Greys. The image on the left shows the royal party setting off down Princes Street. Not a tram in sight. Accompanied by their children, the Duke of Rothesay and Princess Mary, and by the King's uncle, the Duke of Connaught, the King and Queen had been presented with the keys of the city by the Lord Provost on arrival at the station. But waiting at Holyrood House were the great officers of state and the hereditary officers of the household, including, possibly for the last time, the hereditary armour-bearer, Sir Alan Seton Stewart. I set this out in some detail as we can still see in the armour-bearer, at least, vestiges of the visit of George IV, but can also begin to see the outline of all future royal weeks, the monarch and their court present in Edinburgh, while also attending the first kinds of visits and openings that form the main round of royal engagements today. Tuesday was a levee dress morning. First came the presentation of new colours to the Royal Company of Archers, the first time by a monarch in person, and much needed, as the last colours dated from the reign of William IV. Then a levee, albeit just for an hour. And while the King was receiving the gentlemen of Scotland, the Queen received a deputation of women from Glasgow. As this report is from the Scotsman, there's understandably no further detail on who this Western delegation was. The time devoted to the reception was brief, as Her Majesty then nipped off to Bruntsfield to visit the Women and Children's Hospital. Tuesday afternoon was, as we saw earlier, St Giles, the Castle and the National Gallery, and then came Wednesday, St Giles in the morning, and laying the foundation stone of the Usher Hall in the afternoon. In the library of the Lyon office are several personal accounts of ceremonial events. Andrew Ross, conveniently Ross Herald in 1911, has left his own account of the week's events. The first ever service for the Order of the Thistle in its new chapel saw an additional innovation, the use of the sword of state. Its arrival at the Signet Library was even more elaborate and more athletic than the arrival of the honours last July. Once Lyon and his officers had assembled in the Signet Library, an escort provided by the Royal Scots formed up in Parliament Square and proceeded to march Lyon, 2 heralds and 2 pursuivants up to Crown Square in the castle, where Lyon collected the papal sword and carried it back down under escort to the Signet Library. According to Ross Herald, Lyon Balfour was of the view that the sword could only be carried in front of the monarch, and so he, Ross, was deputed to carry it informally into St Giles and not form part of the inward procession of knights from the Signet Library. On the king's arrival, Ross presented the sword to Lyon, who bore it in procession in front of the sovereign. The king's arrival at St Giles was not without incident. Plus ça change. The west doors of the cathedral were closed once the congregation was seated, but couldn't be reopened without a struggle, which somehow involved the Duke of Argyll. The king's arrival was signalled, and the organ struck up the national anthem, only for a runner to carry the news that it was a false alarm. The installation of the two new knights, Lord Ray and the Earl of Mar and Kelly, find echoes on the two recent installations with which we are familiar, where the incipient knights have been escorted from within the church to the Thistle Chapel. In 1911, each knight was led by a herald, hint, hint, and once in the chapel was clothed in their mantle and collar and escorted to their stall. There was a final instant which was only noticed after the service. Andrew Ross relates how as Lyon laid the sword of state back down on a table in the Signet Library, it was noticed that one of the quillons, or crosspieces, were missing. You may remember from my previous talk the outrage over the theft of the Irish crown jewels. This was obviously front of mind for Paul Ross, who later wrote, "It was a most serious affair, for if it were lost, there would be a most terrible scandal." After a brief search of the church, Lyon decided to return with the sword and escort to the castle, where the keeper of the regalia, not unsurprisingly, noticed the missing crosspiece. Lyon assured him that he was returning immediately to St Giles with Ross Herald to search for it. Well, up to a point. Lyon then accepted an invitation from the guard commander to stay for lunch at the castle, and poor Ross had to head back down the hill, presumably still in full dress, to resume the search. When he arrived at St Giles, he asked the doorkeeper if anyone had seen a bit of metal lying around. "Isn't it the bit of the old sword?" came the reply. "Well, it's found. It was picked up by the Earl of Elgin." My great-grandfather, who was a Knight of the Garter, had been invited to the service and had clearly been sat in the processional route. It isn't recorded whether Lyon snagged him with the sword en passant, or he'd merely noticed it when it fell. After 1911, the Order of the Thistle settled into its routine of holding an annual service on the Sunday closest to St Andrew's Day, but George V never held another installation as sovereign of the order. That led in time, as we shall see, to some confusion when the next installation was held in 1937. That's not to say there weren't any other services in St Giles of which the King and the Knights were present. Immediately after the end of the First War, the King and Queen attended a Thanksgiving service, and in 1920, during Royal Week, the King and the Queen, accompanied again by Princess Mary, attended Sunday service at St Giles, and there was a short service in the Thistle Chapel beforehand, attended by the knight and officers of the order. But it is possible to sense a palpable change in the running of the week and of the ceremonial associated with it in these immediate years after the First War. In advance of the Royal Week of 1920, the Scotsman records that Their Majesty's intention is that this visit should not be a ceremonious one, the inference to be drawn that Their Majesties regard a period of residence in Edinburgh as an ordinary incident in the routine of their domestic life. Of course, the ordinary domestic life of George V and Queen Mary was both very domestic and not at all domestic, and we can see that in the arrangements for the week. There was still an arrival carriage procession down Princes Street following the presentation of the keys at the Caledonian. For the first time, there was an investiture in place of a levee. There was a visit and an afternoon party at the newly opened Blinded Soldiers and Sailors Hostel in Newington House, as well as a garden party at Holyrood. The King laid the foundation stone of what is now the King's Buildings at Edinburgh University, and the Queen received an honorary doctorate. Additional visits were made to the RSA again, the Botanics, the Royal Infirmary, and the Edinburgh School of Cookery in Athol Crescent. This was a full week-long programme and was repeated in similar length and content in 1923, when the King and Queen visited Leith, Newhaven, Trinity, and opened the Portobello Power Station, and made a tour of the Borders and a visit to Dunfermline, where the King and Queen held their first ever walkabout. They held a drawing room and a garden party at Holyrood and attended Sunday service at St Giles. In 1927, the cycle of Royal Week was repeated, but this was a few years after the King had called on the Labour Party to form a government for the first time, and was not without political controversy. The Scotsman records that after the King opened a social housing project at Prestonfield, which can be seen in the left-hand image, at which he met several local Labour councillors, an emergency meeting of the Edinburgh Labour Party was called in protest. The motion was put and carried that the councillors be not re-adopted as candidates at the next election. There was some pushback. A councillor, Gillane, remarked that royalty was not the enemy, capitalism was. If they were to rid the country of capitalism, royalty would disappear as a matter of course. Brackets, a voice, quote, not necessarily, close quote, close bracket. Finally, the matter was put to another vote, and the Scotsman records that before the vote was taken, there was another uproar, which lasted several minutes. The chairman shouting, "For God's sake, act like men. You've made a rabble of yourselves." George V and Queen Mary attended their final royal week in Edinburgh in 1934. That same year at Balmoral, the King went stalking with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Not a sentence I wrote lightly. On the hill, the stalker, Grant, who the King knew well and who knew the King well, moved the party into position. The King rested his rifle on Grant's shoulder, fired, and missed. There was a small royal explosion. "Take this damned rifle away. Never let me see it again," said the King to his stalker. "Your Majesty, dinna waste your breath damning the rifle. It was a vera bad shot," was the reply. On the evening of 20th January 1936, at the age of only 70, George V was euthanized by his doctor, Lord Dawson of Penn, who was notorious for assisting his patients into the eternal hereafter. It was said that Lord Dawson of Penn has killed lots of men, so that's why we sing, God Save the King. In the summer after his coronation, George VI came to Edinburgh for a royal week that echoed those of his father, the state arrival again at the Caledonian Station, the keys presented there by the Lord Provost, then a carriage procession to Holyrood House, an inspection of the Royal Company, levees and a garden party, along with presentation of the keys both of Edinburgh and an innovation, Dunbarton castles. But the highlight of the week was the installation of Queen Elizabeth as the first Lady of the Thistle, the first Queen Consort to be admitted to the order, and the first wife and the first daughter of Knights of the Thistle to be admitted. In ceremonial terms, the service of installation would be recognisable today, but the lack of an installation since 1911 meant that by 1937, institutional memory of what to do was a bit dim. A rehearsal was held on the eve of the installation. In addition to the Queen, there were 2 vacancies to be filled by Sir Ian Colquhoun and the Earl of Stair. According to an eyewitness, in fact the only person present at the rehearsal still alive, when Lion Sir Francis Grant called the roll of knights, there was no answer to the first 2 names. This was unsurprising, as the 2 senior knights had died, hence the vacancies, but it appeared to be a surprise to Sir Francis, who, when there was no answer to the name of the Marquis of Aberdeen, exclaimed, "This is most odd. He is usually a very regular attender." At the conclusion of the roll, 2 men present in the chapel had not said anything. Lion turned to them and asked them who they were. "I am Sir Ian Colquhoun," said one, "and this is Lord Stair." The installation, you'll be glad to know, passed off without incident. What might be termed the summer or royal services, usually of installation but not always, of the order, picked up in regularity thereafter. Through the reign of Queen Elizabeth, they tended to fall every other year. The knights assembled in the Signet Library just as they had in 1911 and processed into the cathedral, to their chapel and then to the Preston Isle, and then when St Giles was remodelled, into seats in the sanctuary. In July 1945, when the country was still at war with Japan, the King held an installation for Admiral Viscount Cunningham of Hindhope, formerly Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean and then First Sea Lord. At that service, the White Ensign, which had flown from his flagship HMS Warspite at the Battle of Matapan, was laid up in St Giles. In 1962, Queen Elizabeth installed King Olaf of Norway as the first foreign member of the order, and the following year installed Sir Robert Minges, the wartime Prime Minister of Australia. The sword of state was carried at both the winter and summer services, usually by the senior earl, until it was retired due to grounds of fragility, the sword, that is, not the senior earl. That said, that same year, the senior earl, Lord Elgin, was struck on the head by a scaffolding pole on exiting the cathedral after the rehearsal, and was lucky not to have been permanently retired as well. In 1921, King George V gave royal assent to the Church of Scotland Act, the act which in part knitted the national church back together after the Great Disruption of 1843 seems to have encouraged, or at least coincided with, the Church of Scotland taking a more forward role in national affairs, including ceremonial. The violent end to Home Rule in Ireland and the creation of the Free State dampened the Home Rule movement in Scotland. Just as the Church of Scotland and the Free Church united after 50 years apart, the Liberal Party, which had dominated Scottish politics through the long 19th century, split asunder. In the general election of 1922, Winston Churchill, elected as Liberal MP for Dundee in 1908, was comprehensively defeated, finishing 4th out of 4 in the poll. Tentatively, the Church of Scotland stepped into the vacuum left by the demise of the Liberals and the lack of enthusiasm for Home Rule shown by either the Conservative and Unionist Party or by the Labour Party. The most noticeable impact on the ceremonial life of the country was the revival in the office of Lord High Commissioner to the General Assembly. The office hadn't gone away. The monarch had appointed a representative to the Assembly whenever it met, but after 1921, as the Church of Scotland took on the mantle of the voice of the nation, most clearly expressed in its annual assembly, so the sharpening and refinement of the ceremonial attached to the office of the Lord High Commissioner reflected a sense of state importance to the proceedings of the divines on the Mound. The Lord High Commissioner's role as the sovereign's representative had already been codified in the Order of Precedence published in 1905, where he or she was placed next immediately after the sovereign and the sovereign's consort, above all the other members of the royal family and other royal representatives. The survival, albeit in diminished and diminishing form since the turn of this century, of the court and household presided over by their graces for their week at Holyrood can be traced in lineal order back to the court of James VI and to that of James, Duke of York, when he was sent in partial disgrace by his brother Charles II to Edinburgh as his High Commissioner. The Palace of Holyrood House lends itself to court functions. Sir William Bruce adopted French architectural form and practice that drew the king's subjects closer to the royal presence through a succession of audience chambers. To this day, Lyon and his officers wait on the Lord High Commissioner until he appears in the throne room, attended by his suite, who have, formally at least, witnessed his levee. This is not a lecture on the Church of Scotland in the 20th century, but it is observable in the context of the evolution of state ceremonial in Scotland that the period between the 1921 Act and the Scotland Act of 1978 represents the high watermark of the Church's role as the conscience and representative of the nation. During that period, the office of Lord High Commissioner was enjoyed to its fullest extent, with arguably more ceremonial attached to the office at the end of the period than at the beginning. The 20th century saw the appointment of members of the royal family as Lord High Commissioner for the first time. 3 of George V's sons, the Dukes of York, Kent and Gloucester, all served, setting a precedent that will be followed by all the children of Queen Elizabeth. This year, the King has appointed his brother as Lord High Commissioner, the first royal sibling to be the King's Commissioner since the Duke of York in 1680. Just as the Lord High Commissioner retains the essential elements of the Scottish royal household, including its great officers, who attend on his or her grace, and a chaplain, equerries and ladies in waiting, so his or her formal progress to open the assembly still echoes the riding of the pre-Union parliaments. In 1935, the Duke of Kent was Lord High Commissioner. His procession from Holyrood was preceded by a people's procession comprised of the trades and merchants of Edinburgh, and then the Lords Provost and Provosts of the leading cities and boroughs of the country. Only then came the household cavalcade, pursuivants, then heralds, then lion, then the mace, representing the honours of Scotland, then the suite, and finally, with a sovereign's escort provided by the Scots Greys, the Lord High Commissioner and the Duchess of Kent. Technically, the commission of the Lord High Commissioner begins the moment they arrive at Holyrood House, but in 1981, the then Lord High was conveyed in state by one of Her Majesty's minesweepers from Rosyth to Leith, where he was met, à la George IV, by a guard of honour provided by the constables of that city. It's said that on arrival at Holyrood, he was ticked off by the purse bearer for exceeding his commission. Who, why, or what is the purse bearer? In a note written in preparation for the service to mark the 400th anniversary of the Reformation in Scotland, clearly an excuse for a party if ever there was one, Lyon Innes of Lerney writes that the purse bearer, who was formerly His Grace's family solicitor, combines the functions which in the royal court were performed by the High Chancellor, the Secretary of State, and Keeper of the Great Seal. Hence Lerney's advice, which was adopted and continues to be followed, that when the sovereign is present in person at a meeting of the Assembly, the Secretary of State and now the First Minister, as Keeper of the Seal used in place of the Great Seal of Scotland, acts as purse bearer, a role filled by John Maclay in 1960 and by Jack McConnell in 2002 when the late Queen attended the General Assembly. In addition to the relative revival of the office of Lord High Commissioner, the Church of Scotland also provides the impetus for the holding of the National Service of Thanksgiving, which followed the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953 and the subsequent services of Thanksgiving that marked her silver, golden, and diamond jubilees. Each required the development of state ceremonial to bookend the events themselves. In his recent monograph on the National Service of Thanksgiving held immediately after Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953, Dr. David Torrance places the Church of Scotland in the role of chief motivator. The government of the day, and in particular the Secretary of State, James Stewart, caught the mood. Torrance writes, "The Secretary of State wrote to the Queen's private secretary on 2nd of May 1952, just as the Church's committee was about to present its report to the General Assembly. Stewart suggested if the Queen felt able on her coronation visit to Scotland to attend a short national service of dedication and thanksgiving, there to which representatives from all parts of the country would be invited, and if further some appropriate use could be made at such a service of the Scottish regalia, this would give great satisfaction both to the Church of Scotland and to the Scottish people generally." Note the emphasis, first the Church and then the people. You'll remember from my previous talk that the then Secretary for Scotland, Lord Balfour of Burghley, had suggested at the time of the coronation of Edward VII that there might be a Scottish event separate from the service in Westminster Abbey. In the preparations for the first visit of George VI to Edinburgh after his coronation, there were suggestions that there might be something that nodded to Scotland's distinct place in the Union. But at the same time, there were also suggestions that the King and Queen might travel to India and hold a Durbar, just as had George V and Queen Mary. Neither came to pass, not least because the King's ministers, with the very real prospect of war on the horizon, sent the royal couple on a hugely important visit, first to Paris, then Ottawa, and then to Washington. David Torrance's essay on the 1953 service is so good and so comprehensive that I really can't add anything of significance. There are, however, a couple of themes that are worth exploring as they influence the development of state ceremonial through the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The first is that most of the elements that made up the 1953 service were already in use: the state procession, the involvement of the great officers of state and household, the participation of the royal company, and the use and centrality of St. Giles. What was unique was the stitching of all the elements together to create something greater than the sum of its parts, and to that we must tip our caps to Lyon Innes of Lerney. I know it's fashionable to deconstruct Sir Thomas, but he had a very clear sense of what state ceremonial should look like. The correspondence files at the Lyon office make it very clear he was deeply interested in both the spectacle and the order of the ceremonial. As he wrote to the Secretary of State, the public, and indeed the world public, expect to see something consistent with Scottish tradition and of the ceremonial which came down through the ages. A carrying of the honours by, quote, officials in uniform, close quote, instead of earls in robes would be an anachronism and an anticlimax, reminiscent not of Scotland's history but of some Balkan kinglet's parade. It would take only very little deviation from it to change a most inspiring and evocative progress into a banal fiasco. It is the difference between the appearance of Scotland's heralds and members of the Sealed Knot Society. The uniforms may be equally impressive, but the heralds are there because they're part of a living national story. The guys with the muskets and the floppy hats are there because, well, for a whole host of other reasons. Lerney innovated by using the past for present purposes. He had a very clear view of Scotland's story, perhaps not one shared by everyone, either then or now. But in the post-war years, that clarity of view aligned with that of the Church of Scotland and, after a little persuasion, Her Majesty's government. The second point to note is that the public pay attention. State ceremonial must function in the public space and involve the public. There is admittedly a bit of a Venn diagram. Ceremonial that's private, such as the installation of a Knight of the Thistle in the chapel with the doors closed for a reason. Ceremonial which is public, which is most of it, otherwise it wouldn't be ceremonial, and other royal events in public which are not ceremonial, most obviously a royal walkabout. So it was in 1953 that public sentiment was, might we say, unimpressed by the Queen's choice of clothes for the national service, the unspoken thought being that somehow the sovereign had let the side down. The point wasn't lost, and as soon as it was possible to do so, it was remedied. In 1960, the Church of Scotland invited Her Majesty to attend its commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the Reformation. There was to be a special meeting of the Assembly in October. Planning in earnest started between the Lyon office of the Scottish between the Lyon and Scottish office that June. The issue of the Queen's dress emerged quite quickly. Lyon found himself pushing against an open door. No to wearing the sovereign's thistle mantle. The Queen made it clear that while that might be appropriate, she wanted only to wear the thistle mantle in services attached to the Order of the Thistle, but yes to full dress. This was a state occasion, the first time that a monarch had visited the General Assembly in over 300 years. There was a state carriage procession from Holyrood House and a service of thanksgiving at St Giles, and then the Queen travelled the short distance to the Assembly Hall. In the words of the Life and Work magazine, for many, the real depth of meaning of this great day was not reached until the Assembly was constituted in the afternoon. Every available seat was occupied. The bright television lights caught up the fresh gilded ornamentation of the Queen's throne and etched sharply the colourful costume of the heralds and pursuivants. There was a breath-catching moment of splendour when Her Majesty the Queen entered the throne gallery and stood before the throne, a regal, radiant figure in a full-length, brilliant turquoise gown and jacket. Then history was made afresh. The Queen bowed 3 times to the Assembly. The Assembly bowed back. The moderator conveyed the greetings of the Assembly, and the Queen spoke. The Queen returned to open the Assembly in 1969, and if anything, her appearance was even more impressive than in 1960, with her long dress and hat replaced by furs and a tiara. In 1977, fur had been replaced by fashionable wide collars and long hair, and that was just the clergy. The pattern of the ceremonial of 1953 and 1960 shaped the Jubilee Thanksgiving events that followed later in the reign. George V hadn't attended a formal Jubilee service in Scotland in 1936, but that changed in 1977. In late 1975, the Scottish Office started planning for the Queen's Jubilee Tour of Scotland. It was to take in all the cities and be bookended by 2 state events, a service of Thanksgiving in Glasgow, a novelty but as much a political decision as a practical one, and the opening of the General Assembly and a service for the Order of the Thistle in Edinburgh. There's an intriguing note in the Lyon Office files narrating an early planning meeting involving Sir James Menteith Grant, now Lyon, Sir Eric Penn, the Controller of the Household, and Mr Ogilvie from the Scottish Office. Precedent for form and order is clearly set by the 1953 service, and the importance attached to the service of Thanksgiving is clearly in the equivalence given to an incoming state visit. There's some change. The 1963 Peerage Act had widened the peerage franchise, and the peers of Scotland are no longer to be invited en bloc. However, it's worth noting Mr Ogilvie's admission that their involvement was customary. Scotland has its own rules, after all. So it was that the Queen's Silver Jubilee week in Scotland involved 3 state carriage processions, 1 in Glasgow and 2 in Edinburgh, 1 for the Assembly and 1 for the service of installation of the Duke of Rothesay as a Knight of the Thistle. The iconic illustration of the Edinburgh procession to the General Assembly was captured by the artist Donald Anderson for the Scottish Field. It's perhaps little wonder that later that summer, the Bay City Rollers released their hit single, You Made Me Believe in Magic. In addition to the Jubilee celebrations in 1977, 2002 and 2012, there were 3 state visits to Scotland by foreign heads of state. That's to say 3 state visits that began and ended in Scotland and not side visits to state visits begun in London. In 1962, King Olav of Norway pulled into Leith Roads in the Norwegian Royal Yacht, and in 1975, the young Carl Gustaf of Sweden flew into Edinburgh Airport. In 1984, King Harold of Norway arrived at Leith, as had his father. All state visits have a shape to them, and they start with a formal welcome of the visiting head of state. King Olaf was met by the Queen at the Caledonian station, conveniently having taken the train from Leith. King Carl Gustaf and King Harold were welcomed at a reviewing stand erected in Charlotte Square. All the arrivals were followed by a carriage procession to Holyrood House, where George V proved the route. His descendants and cousins follow. There's no reason why the state visit of King Harold should be the last to Scotland. The new King and Queen of Denmark have close Scottish connections. Queen Mary's aunt is reported still to live in Long Nidri. Within the next decade, both Norway and Sweden will most likely have new monarchs. It may well be time to dust off the planning files from 1984. And for completeness, although it wasn't a state visit as such, I think it was termed a state reception, we should add the visit of the late Pope Benedict, a visit that enabled the late Queen to turn out her bodyguard, doubtless to make a point about their relative seniority and more practical uniform than the Swiss Guard. I am conscious that I haven't covered all the ceremonies of state that make up the heraldic year. In 1924, King George opened the National War Memorial, which is an excuse to share the picture of by now Lyon Swinton, who devised the ceremonial still followed today. Since Edward VII demanded entrance to Edinburgh Castle in 1903, each of his successors has received its keys on the esplanade, and the sovereign's incoming governor has likewise had his commission read out by Lyon, who's demanded entrance on behalf of that sovereign. There is a special treat for the junior pursuivant, and both Elizabeth and I have undertaken that duty in going to knock 3 times on the wicket gate and attempting to remember to pass over the just double when challenged by the sentry wielding a sharpened bayonet. Some ceremonial was devised for great gatherings that have never been repeated. In 1938, George VI and Queen Elizabeth arrived in state to open the vast Empire exhibition at Bellahouston Park, although to be wholly accurate, the opening ceremony was at Ibrox. In 1983, the Queen drove in a carriage around Holyrood Park to inspect the Boys' Brigade on its centenary. Somewhere in the ranks was a young BB from the 1st Bishopton Company, the son of a minister in the Church of Scotland. Whether that day, standing in the sunshine, waiting to be inspected, was the catalyst for a determination to sweep away all that he perceived as old-fashioned and out of kilter with the new, modern, cool Britannia, we may not know, but we might ask him. For my friend from university, Douglas Alexander, emerges as a bit of an anti-hero in our story, or perhaps an exception that proves the rule. You get to judge. By 1999, Douglas was an MP and special advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and another son of the manse, Gordon Brown. Together they devised and drove the creation of the devolved Scottish Parliament. This new institution was, in their eyes, to mark a radical step forward in Scotland's constitutional future and in no way to be a reminder of an old sang. I am conscious that the papers in the Lyon office, which set out in full detail the evolution of thinking of the ceremonial attached to the opening of the Scottish Parliament by the Queen that year, are still, broadly speaking, within the 30-year rule, and that most of the participants are still alive. I will stick then to the coverage published in the newspapers of the day. The media quickly identified 2 groups among the politician parents of the new Parliament. They called them the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. The Roundheads wanted nothing in the way of anything that had come before. As the arrangements for the opening tilted in that direction, they pushed back. On 29th June 1999, the Scotland on Sunday reported that Douglas Alexander said that the event had turned into a tragedy because it featured Scottish establishment figures such as the Duke of Hamilton and the Royal Company of Archers. The MP said it amounted to a poor facsimile of Scotland's feudal past and an expression of outmoded Scottishness. George Reid wrote to the Scotsman that he was opposed to men in tights parading up the high street, but to be fair, he sought to devise an event in which people and monarch complement each other. The Roundheads, for all their claims to reflect the modern zeitgeist, didn't get an easy ride in the media. Magnus Linklater spoke for Middle Scotland when he wrote, "History and tradition, far from imprisoning a nation, provide the solid foundation on which it rests. The Scottish honours, far from being the archaic trappings of an outdated monarchy, are proud symbols of power. Far from deriding these traditions, we should celebrate them. Why should we be embarrassed by all that today? On the contrary, we should embrace it. Do not banish the rituals that people will actually enjoy. and which tell the world about a nation which wears its past with pride. As it turned out, the ceremonial attached to the presence of the sovereign in the Scottish Parliament has evolved since 1999, until almost the last minute in that year, parliamentary business managers tried unsuccessfully to have the Crown of Scots administratively placed in the chamber by Historic Scotland. But sense and history prevailed, and the Crown, its hereditary bearer, Lyon, the officers of arms, the Royal Company, and their Captain General now accompany the monarch into the chamber, to paraphrase the Anglican hymn book, being both ancient and modern at the same time. I am conscious that there are two very recent ceremonial events in Edinburgh, which Lyon alluded to at the beginning of my talk, which should by right be included in our review this evening. But the service for the lying at rest of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth and the national service of thanksgiving for her son and daughter-in-law are still, to my mind, so fresh that they almost remain in the present. I can still hear the sound of the silence of the crowd as the royal hearse drew up outside St Giles, and if I close my eyes, I can see the September sunshine as it picked out the jewels on the crown atop the coffin. I began this talk by claiming that state ceremonial has become more colourful and more flamboyant over the last century. Consider George V in a morning coat at Sunday service at St Giles, the late Queen in her day dress and handbag at the 1953 service, and contrast that with the King, his Queen, and his elder son, all in full dress in their thistle mantles, as in a stroke of genius, the honours of Scotland, having been brought down from the castle in a people's procession, are presented in turn to new words and music, capturing the words of Magnus Linklater, the stories of a nation which wears its past with pride. Did we get it right? Well, I'm tempted to give Magnus the final word. In the Times the next day, he wrote that it was a splendidly orchestrated and intensely Scottish celebration of the King and Queen, carried on triumphantly. And just in case that's insufficient, the paper goes on to record the thoughts of an unnamed bartender at the No. 1 High Street pub, who was late for his shift as the crowds were so heavy. It was non-stop from 2 till 5. It was rammed. It was mental. At one point, we had no Tennant's glasses left. George V would most probably have been very amused. I hope also that Miss Olive Walton of the Women's Political and Social Union of Dundee, on seeing Lady Dorian and Dame Catherine Granger and my esteemed colleagues Elizabeth Rhodes, Isla Herald and Linlithgow Perseverant, among so many others, would have considered her protest in 1914 to have been worth it. In the Lyon office, there is a copy of a paper written by Don Pottinger when, as Unicorn Perseverant, he gave a talk to the constables of Holyrood House on state ceremonial. It might have made more sense for me simply to reread it to you this evening in place of my own wisherings, but let me adopt his conclusions as my own. The purpose of state ceremonial, he wrote, is the expression of the ethos of the community, and as such, state ceremonies are conducted mainly for the benefit of the spectators. They must be formal, dignified, and yet communal. State ceremonies are not about the individual, no matter how important they think they are. The ceremonies must be conducted in ritual costume, which reflects the office and not the holder. Finally, he writes, and above all, the nature of the ceremonials must appear spontaneous. No one must appear to be visibly in charge or giving commands, because this is contrary to the expression of communal harmony obtained when each is seen playing their part without having to be told, which is the purpose of ceremonial. I know what my part is without being told, and that is to wrap up. It's been an absolute pleasure to have spent the last hour in your company, and I thank you for your attention.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank
We're
you.
going to take your slides down, Adam.
Yep. There we go. Stop sharing. Oh, and you're back. You're on screen.
I have no idea what's happened, but I can see that I'm now allowed to put the camera down. Well, I'm sure everybody would like to just and let me, on behalf of all of you, because it's so difficult on these occasions to actually say thank you to Adam for again an absolutely riveting talk. And if you haven't already used your clapometer, please do it. If not, please, Adam, you take our great thanks for the hard work and the effort you've taken. And we've got some interesting and new, well, not new, but some ceremonial to do this year, and we'll have to have a conversation fairly quickly about that. But we've got about 10 minutes. Can I take some questions, and can you bear with me? Can you put your hands up if you'd like to actually ask Adam anything or make a comment? There's Jock Miller. Could I have Jock? If you could mute yourself and say what you want to say.
I was trying to clap.
Oh, clap. Well, you can. Well, we've got that. Anybody else? Anybody else would like to ask a question or make a comment? Sally and Bill have got Carr have got. I think they've got their hand up. Is that correct?
Yes.
On you go then. Ask your question or your comment.
Oh yeah. Sorry,
Go on, Sally or Bill.
My camera is still off.
Well, just ask the question and Adam will pick it up.
Yes, my point was, I think don't underestimate the commitment of the members of the CNO. Many of them may be on the wrong side, they may be Covenanters, but there are many committed royalists.
Forgive me if I in any way cast aspersions on the loyalty and fealty of members of the Sealed Knot. I can be stricken from the record. That wasn't quite the point I was trying to make. There are some who would argue that you can replace heralds, officers of arms, members of the Royal Company with paid reenactors, and you'd have the same effect. And I don't share that.
Can I be a paid reenactor? I've been paid. I defended the King's Standard at the Battle of Dunbar. I never got paid.
Well, but you're still alive, so something obviously went wrong.
Well, not many of the parliamentary cavalry who tried to get the Standard are still alive. Thank you.
And then let's see if we can get some questions or comments. Anybody there?
I really enjoyed the speech. Thank you very much.
Well done, Bill. You're all very quiet tonight.
I'm concerned that my co-officers of arms are all very quiet, which is unusual and rather concerning, actually.
Well, I'm keeping deeply quiet because I'm the only one here who's a general in the Sealed Knot. So I feel there's definitely, in fact, Adam makes a very valid point, because once I became a general in the Sealed Knot, it occurred to me I could be the Lord Lyon King of Arms. So I simply invented a new role for myself and then made a tabard, which in fact is now used in the Kate Kennedy procession, Adam, to represent Lyon Campbell. But that is the problem.
No more confessions, George, because there'll be very few absolutions done if you've been breaking the rules. But I think Elizabeth put her hand up, did she?
She did.
I did and took it down again. It was wonderful, Adam, and of course brought back for me many happy memories and recollections of the things that went wrong, that got lots of giggles from the Queen, and it was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Elizabeth.
And thank you for your time, Elizabeth. And there are a number of people on the school who've given me of their time, but Elizabeth in particular, who sat down and just sort of unloaded, which was great. And I'm so sorry that I only just managed to capture a fraction of it. But yeah, and I think sometimes as as the officers of arms, we do beat ourselves up if things go wrong. And I'm not looking at any of my colleagues in particular, but two things to that. One, things have gone wrong in the past and will go wrong again in the future. And I was intrigued by, and if you get a chance, if you haven't read Andrew Ross's deeply comprehensive note on the 1911 visit. I mean, first of all, for the west doors of the St Giles Cathedral not to be open, you know, to struggle to open them. I don't know how the Duke of Argyll got involved. I suspect as Master of the Household he was sort of loitering, and then for a piece of the Sword of State just to fall off in the procession. And there are others, and without naming names, there was a moment in a very recent service where the steps weren't moved out in time, and one of my fellow officers got deeply distressed that something had gone wrong. But actually, if you watch the coverage, Sally Magnuson takes a breath and then says, "And now the ceremonial steps of state are brought forward to the Duke of Hamilton." Just have to wait. Things will happen.
Right, Elizabeth, thank you for your kind words. Philip, you've got your hand up.
Yes. First of all, I wanted to say that never becoming the junior officer of arms was I expecting the threat of being poked with a bayonet at the gates of Edinburgh Castle. I wish someone had told me that beforehand. However, I did want to say thank you for a brilliant talk, Marchmont Herald, and like yourself, after the last couple of years, I find myself able to close my eyes and find myself back in a number of those events. And I don't think that's finding myself back in my own memory. I literally feel that when I close my eyes and remember those events of the last 2 years, that I'm almost standing there next to you in your own memory as well. But what your talk has really made me appreciate is how, as a current officer of arms, I suppose I have so much to thank from the officers of arms before me as well, and all that they've done for ceremonial, all that they've done for being a part of that. It's very much, you've given me a feeling of standing on the shoulders of giants. So thank you very much, Marchmont.
Well, Philip, you have an advantage over the rest of us in that I was able to go into the Lyon office and read some of the, Don Pottinger, Andrew Ross, and others. You have written, if others on this call don't know, two very detailed sort of present histories. One of the state funeral and one of the coronation, and both of those will be consulted by my successor's successor when they come to give a talk to the Lyon Society in 2058. And yeah, so that's, you're in history. I'll be forgotten.
I don't know. I don't think that'll take place. Any other questions? Last questions? Last comment? Elizabeth, there you go.
Really, on Philip's point, it's also worth making note of the sidelines. I mean, I think of the opening of the Forth Road Bridge when a couple of officers of arms had a call of nature. The fun bits need to be remembered as well. So I hope, Philip, you've remembered the fun bits that weren't just the ceremonial, but the sideline bits.
And that, if I may, that oral history is fundamentally important to the way in which the officers of arms operate. Because, Elizabeth, I remember you telling, when I was a baby precedent, I remember you telling me how Don Pottinger, wasn't it? And I can't remember who the other officer was.
Andy Lawson.
Andy Lawson, struck by a need to just, before everything happened, strode off across the esplanade in front of the bridge to find comfort. And that thought suddenly popped back into my head as the Queen's coffin pulled away from Wellington Arch, taking everybody was going to Windsor, including Lyon, but not the Scottish officers of arms, who had to make it back to a bus on which I could see the gentlemen of arms already climbing at some speed. And we were at the other end of the esplanade, as it were. So I said to poor Philip and Colin, make for the bus in a tidy fashion, go. And I did so, one, knowing that they would, but also remembering your anecdote. So yes, there may be state ceremonial and then there is state unceremonial, but it all sort of gets jumbled up.
Okay, that's 1 minute past 8, so I'm going to keep to the rule and try to and wind up. Again, can I say thank you to everybody for coming along tonight? It's quite exciting for me to see old friends' names on the list of people that are attending. And for the first time, I've just noticed that a friend of mine's from Washington, Paul Ash, who's the director of the Bells in Washington, is online tonight. So he's most welcome, and that's a welcome addition for me, because I'm not very great at actually corresponding as well as I should. So this has given us an opportunity to welcome people from a whole variety of backgrounds. So Paul and all those from overseas, and also those from Scotland and south of the border, thank you for your attendance today. We are going to plan another couple of meetings, and I think that one's booked for October, and we're hoping to do one in June as well. The topics will be released nearer the time. Just to keep you informed about the actual society itself, to say that if the state ceremonial is difficult to actually bring about and make happen, digitization in the world in which we live is more complicated than you can ever imagine, partly because as soon as you think you've grasped it, they tell you haven't thought about what if the digital material goes away, what do you do with it then? And so we are working away at it. The first bit online will be Jim Floyd's Gazetteer, and we're just about there with that. This coming Friday, the newsletter will go out to you, and there's a number of articles there, and I hope that you enjoy them. And then finally, let me just say a thank you to Fiona, who sets this up and does such a good job for us, but also to Adam, but partly because you've got the most wonderful storytelling approach, as well as being so accurate and so and really so thorough about the factual basis of it and reflective of it. And I don't know which of your boys is there, but you can certainly tell them that the Lord Lyon thinks that they have a cool dad, no matter what they think. So I think you've done a great job tonight, and wait and see the next set of events that come up. Take care of yourselves, and I look forward to having a wee word with you sometime down the road. Elizabeth, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Be good.
Bye.